August 7th, 1942 dawned with an eerie stillness over the Solomon Islands. But beneath that deceptive calm, 11,000 United States Marines prepared to make history. The jungle-covered island of Guadalcanal lay before them, seemingly insignificant in the vast Pacific Ocean. Yet this speck of land would become the graveyard where empires collided and the tide of war would forever turn. Nobody in Washington had heard of Guadalcanal 6 months earlier. The name itself, bestowed by Spanish explorer Alvaro de Mendoza in 1598, meant nothing to the Americans, British, or even most Japanese. It was simply another green dot on colonial maps. Inhabited by Melanesian peoples who had lived there for thousands of years, fishing its waters and farming its volcanic soil. The island measured approximately 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in dense rainforest, razor-sharp kunai grass, and mountains that rose over 7,000 feet into clouds that never seemed to clear. But everything changed when Allied reconnaissance flights spotted something that made Admiral Ernest King's blood run cold in his Washington office. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal's northern coast, according to declassified intelligence reports from the United States Naval Institute archives. This discovery transformed an obscure tropical island into the most strategically vital piece of real estate in the Pacific theater. The mathematics of warfare are brutally simple. An operational airfield on Guadalcanal would give Japanese bombers the range to strike. Allied supply lines between America and Australia, effectively severing the lifeline that kept the war effort alive in the South Pacific. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, understood this cold equation perfectly as his transport ships cut through the dark waters toward their objective. The Japanese Empire, intoxicated by 6 months of unbroken victories since Pearl Harbor, had expanded across the Pacific like a rising flood. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, the Dutch East Indies had all fallen before the Emperor's forces with shocking speed. The rising sun flag flew over territories spanning thousands of miles, and Tokyo's military planners spoke confidently of dictating peace terms from a position of overwhelming strength. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army from his headquarters in Rabaul, considered Guadalcanal a backwater assignment. He had dispatched a small construction battalion, mostly Korean laborers supervised by the 11th Construction Unit, to carve an airstrip from the jungle. The project, which the Japanese called Lunja Airfield, was nearly complete when Vandegrift's Marines began loading their landing craft in the pre-dawn darkness of that August morning. The young Marines boarding the Higgins boats had trained in New Zealand, far from home, knowing only that they were headed somewhere hot and dangerous. Most had never seen combat. Many had lied about their age to enlist after Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotic fury and youthful invincibility. They carried M-19-03 Springfield rifles, heavy packs, and orders to seize and hold the airfield at all costs. As the first wave of landing craft churned toward Red Beach, a strange silence hung over the island. Where were the defenders? Where were the massive artillery bombardments that had slaughtered Marines at Tarawa? The coconut palms swayed gently in the tropical breeze, and the only sound was the throaty rumble of boat engines and the nervous breathing of young men contemplating their mortality. What none of them understood yet was that they were about to begin 6 months of the most savage fighting in American military history. Campaigns so brutal that both sides would come to call Guadalcanal by another name entirely, the Island of Death. The landing craft grounded on the black volcanic sand of Guadalcanal at 9:10 in the morning. August 7th, 1942. And United States Marines poured onto foreign soil for the first time in World War II. Corporal Robert Leckie of the 1st Marine Regiment hit the beach with his weapon raised, expecting withering fire from concealed bunkers. Instead, he found himself running toward a tree line that remained disturbingly quiet. The Japanese construction workers had fled into the jungle at the first sight of American warships on the horizon. Lieutenant Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, who commanded the small security detachment, had withdrawn his forces inland, recognizing the impossibility of defending against such overwhelming numbers on the beach. The Marines advanced cautiously through abandoned camps where breakfast still sat on tables and tools lay scattered where workers had dropped them mid-swing. Major General Alexander Vandegrift established his command post near the Lunja River and sent patrols racing toward the airfield. By late afternoon, his men stood on the prize they had come to claim. The runway stretched nearly 3,000 feet through cleared jungle, almost complete but missing crucial components like fuel storage and revetments. Marine engineers immediately began assessing what would be needed to make it operational for American aircraft. Across the narrow body of water separating Guadalcanal from the smaller islands of Talagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the landing had gone very differently. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, countered fierce resistance from Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces who had no intention of surrendering. These elite Japanese Marines fought from caves and bunkers, extracting a heavy price for every yard of ground. Major Robert Williams led his company up the slopes of Tanambogo against interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The Japanese defenders dug into coral caves that resisted even direct hits from naval gunfire. Fought with suicidal determination. Williams fell wounded, and his executive officer took command only to be killed minutes later. The small island, barely large enough for a football field, consumed an entire Marine battalion before the last defenders finally died at their positions. Back on Guadalcanal, the successful but unopposed landing created a dangerous sense of complacency. Vandegrift's staff officers began unpacking supplies on the beach, stacking ammunition, rations, and medical equipment in neat piles that would take days to properly disperse. Transport ships anchored offshore, methodically unloading the massive quantities of materials needed to sustain combat operations in hostile territory. Nobody yet understood that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was already responding to the American incursion with characteristic aggression. From his headquarters aboard the battleship Yamato at Truk Lagoon, Yamamoto issued orders that would unleash the Imperial Japanese Navy's fury on the unsuspecting American fleet. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa received those orders at his command post in Rabaul with grim satisfaction. He would assemble a strike force of cruisers and destroyers to attack the American invasion fleet under cover of darkness, a tactic at which Japanese forces excelled. The Americans, he knew, had poor night-fighting doctrine and inferior radar systems. They would never see his ships coming until torpedoes were already in the water. As night fell over Guadalcanal on that first day, Marines dug foxholes in the soft volcanic soil and listened to unfamiliar jungle sounds. Private First Class Eugene Sledge later wrote in his memoir that the darkness seemed to press down with physical weight, thick and suffocating. Strange birds called from the trees and larger things moved through the underbrush, their nature unknown and therefore terrifying. The airfield they had captured sat silent and incomplete, under tropical stars that seemed impossibly bright. Vandegrift walked its length that evening, understanding that this strip of cleared dirt represented everything. If the Navy could hold the seas around Guadalcanal long enough for engineers to finish the runway and bring in fighter aircraft, they might establish a permanent foothold. If not, his Marines would be stranded, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. Neither Vandegrift nor his men knew that, in approximately 48 hours, the United States Navy would suffer its worst defeat in history just offshore. August 9th, 1942, would become the darkest night in United States Navy history. A catastrophe so complete that its details would remain partially classified for decades. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's strike force, consisting of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer, approached Guadalcanal through a passage that would forever after bear the name Iron Bottom, sound for the ships that would rest on its floor. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was the first to die. At 1:43 in the morning, lookouts aboard the Canberra spotted something dark against the darker ocean. But before they could sound alarm, Type 93 torpedoes were already slicing through the water. The Japanese Long Lance torpedo was a technological masterpiece, powered by pure oxygen, leaving no wake and carrying a warhead that could break a cruiser's spine. Canberra's hull erupted in fire and seawater as 2 torpedoes struck almost simultaneously. Captain Frank Getting was blown from his feet, mortally wounded. Flames raced through the ship as fuel oil ignited, turning the cruiser into a floating inferno. Ben, trapped below decks, screamed as the sea rushed in through gaping wounds in the hull. Those on deck faced an equally terrible choice: burn or swim in shark-infested waters. The American heavy cruiser USS Astoria, commanded by Captain William Greenman, never had time to bring her main batteries to bear. Japanese searchlights suddenly blazed across the water, pinning Astoria in their glare like an insect under a microscope. Seconds later, 8-inch shells from Mikowa's flagship Chikai began hammering the American vessel with methodical precision. According to the official U.S. Navy historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Astoria absorbed 65 shell hits in less than 30 minutes of combat. Fire spread through her superstructure, detonating ready ammunition and turning gun turrets into crematoriums for their crews. Captain Greenman remained on the bridge even as steel fragments cut through flesh and bone around him, shouting orders until a shell burst killed him instantly. USS Quincy died next, caught in a crossfire between Japanese cruisers that approached from both sides. Commander William Moran, the executive officer, later testified that the bridge was hit so quickly that Admiral Norman Scott and Captain Samuel Moore were killed before they could issue a single command. Shells penetrated Quincy's thin armor and exploded inside, sending white-hot fragments ricocheting through crowded spaces. The heavy cruiser USS Vincennes, flagship of the American cruiser force, burned like a torch against the night sky. Her captain, Frederick Reifkohl, fought to save his ship even as it settled lower in the water. Damage control parties worked frantically to seal flooding compartments, but the sea was winning. By dawn, Vincennes would slip beneath the waves, taking over 300 men with her. The Battle of Savo Island lasted 32 minutes. Mikowa's force achieved a tactical victory so complete that he could have annihilated the American transport fleet anchored off Guadalcanal, leaving Vandergrift's Marines stranded without hope of reinforcement or evacuation. Over 1,000 American and Australian sailors died in the dark waters, many trapped inside steel coffins that sank too quickly for escape. But Mikowa made a decision that would haunt Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. Fearing American carrier aircraft might catch his force at dawn, he withdrew toward Rabel without attacking the vulnerable transport ships. That single decision, born of excessive caution, preserved the American foothold on Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, commanding the South Pacific area from his headquarters in Noumea, received news of the disaster with stunned disbelief. 4 heavy cruisers sunk, 1 destroyer damaged, and over 1,000 men dead constituted the worst defeat ever inflicted on the United States Navy in a fair fight. The Japanese had accomplished this while sustaining only superficial damage to 3 cruisers and losing fewer than 60 men. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded the amphibious force, made the painful decision to withdraw his remaining ships immediately, taking with them much of the Marines' heavy equipment, ammunition, and supplies still aboard the transports. The Marines on Guadalcanal watched their lifeline disappear over the horizon on August 9, 1942, and understood with sickening clarity that they were now completely alone. Major General Alexander Vandergrift stood on the beach as the last transport ship vanished from sight, leaving his 17,000 men stranded on a hostile island with barely 4 days of rations, limited ammunition, and a partially completed airfield that attracted Japanese attention like blood draw sharks. The Japanese High Command, emboldened by their stunning naval victory at Savo Island, made a catastrophic miscalculation. Intelligence reports from Tokyo estimated American strength on Guadalcanal at perhaps 2,000 men, a demoralized force that would collapse under determined assault. Lieutenant Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki received orders to land his elite regiment on Guadalcanal and sweep the Americans into the sea. Ichiki was a veteran of combat in China and possessed the absolute confidence characteristic of Japanese officers who had never tasted defeat. His regiment, the Ichiki Detachment, had been designated as the initial assault force for the invasion of Midway before that operation ended in disaster. Now they would restore Japanese honor by reclaiming Guadalcanal through aggressive night attack, the tactic at which Imperial forces excelled. The Ichiki Detachment, numbering approximately 916 men, landed east of the American perimeter on August 19th. Ichiki conducted minimal reconnaissance, convinced that overwhelming the weak American forces required only speed and warrior spirit. He formed his men into assault columns and began advancing westward along the coast, toward the airfield. Private First Class John Bacelone, a machine gunner from the 7th Marine Regiment, was dug in along the Ailu River when Japanese scouts were spotted moving through the coconut groves. Bacelone, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night, recognized the telltale signs of a major attack developing. He positioned his 2 Browning M1917 machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar where the river met the ocean. The Japanese attack began just after midnight on August 21st with a ferocity that shocked even veteran Marines. Ichiki's soldiers charged across the sandbar in successive waves, bayonets fixed, screaming battle cries meant to freeze enemy blood. American machine guns opened fire at point-blank range, and the sandbar became a killing ground illuminated by muzzle flashes and exploding grenades. Baselin's guns fired continuously, the barrels glowing red-hot in the darkness. When ammunition began running low, he sprinted through enemy fire to drag more belts forward, then resumed firing until the barrels threatened to warp from heat. Around him, Marines fought hand-to-hand with Japanese soldiers who reached the Marine positions, rifle butts and entrenching tools serving as clubs in desperate close-quarters combat. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry charged into the machine gun fire with suicidal determination. Officers led from the front, samurai swords raised, only to be cut down before reaching American lines. The tactical doctrine that had worked against Chinese forces in Manchuria failed catastrophically. Against Marines equipped with automatic weapons and supported by artillery, by dawn, over 800 of Ichiki's 916 men lay dead on the blood-soaked sandbar. The colonel himself, confronted with the magnitude of his failure, earned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide rather than face the disgrace of defeat. Marine patrols advancing across the battlefield after sunrise were shocked by the carnage. Bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep in places, cut down by overlapping fields of fire. The Battle of the Tenaru River, as it became known despite actually occurring at the Ailu, demonstrated to both sides that Guadalcanal would not be won quickly or cheaply. Japanese planners in Rabaul began revising their estimates of American strength upward and committed additional forces to what they now called the Guadalcanal problem. For the Marines, victory came at the cost of learning what kind of enemy they faced. These were not soldiers who would surrender when the tactical situation became hopeless. August 20th, 1942 marked a turning point when the first American aircraft landed on the captured airfield. Now christened Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. The arrival of Marine Air Group 23, commanded by Colonel William Wallace, transformed Guadalcanal from an isolated outpost into an operational airbase that could challenge Japanese control of the surrounding waters. Captain Marion Carl and Captain John Smith led the initial fighter contingent, 19 Grumman FOF Wildcats and 12 Douglas SBD. Dauntless dive bombers that touched down on Henderson's rough coral runway amid clouds of dust. The pilots climbed from their cramped cockpits into stifling heat and humidity, their aircraft already showing signs of wear from operating in the corrosive tropical environment. Henderson Field became the most valuable piece of real estate in the Pacific. During daylight hours, American fighters and dive bombers controlled the seas within a 300-mile radius, attacking Japanese ships attempting to reinforce or resupply their ground forces on Guadalcanal. But when darkness fell, the sea belonged to the Tokyo Express. The nickname Marines gave to the fast destroyer runs that raced down the slot between the Solomon Islands. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka commanded these nocturnal supply missions with brilliant efficiency. His destroyers, painted black and crude by sailors trained in night operations, would race from Rabaul to Guadalcanal in a single night, unload troops and supplies, and escape before dawn exposed them to Henderson's aircraft. The Japanese called these runs rat runs, acknowledging the desperate nature of supplying forces under constant air attack. Major General Kyote Kawaguchi arrived via the Tokyo Express with 6,000 men of the 35th Infantry Brigade, determined to succeed where Ichiki had failed, methodical officer who had commanded forces in China and the Philippines. Kawaguchi understood that American defenses required careful reconnaissance and coordinated assault rather than frontal charges. He spent days positioning his forces south of Henderson Field, moving through the jungle under cover of darkness. The terrain south of Henderson was among the most hostile in the world. Steep ridges covered in vegetation so thick that visibility dropped 2 feet rather than yards rose from malarial swamps. The jungle canopy blocked sunlight, creating perpetual twilight populated by venomous snakes, foot-long centipedes, and clouds of mosquitoes that spread dengue fever and malaria with democratic impartiality. Kawaguchi's plan called for a 3-pronged night assault on September 13th. It would penetrate the marine perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The main attack would strike south of the airfield where a low ridge, barely elevated above the surrounding jungle, offered the best approach. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion held this sector, fewer than 800 men defending a front that stretched over a mile. The Japanese bombardment began at sunset, when cruisers and destroyers offshore opened fire on Henderson Field. 14-inch shells crashed into the runway, detonating fuel drums and destroying parked aircraft. Marines dove into foxholes and revetments as high-explosive rounds walked across the airfield in methodical patterns. Simultaneously, Japanese artillery positioned in the hills south of the perimeter added their fire to the maelstrom. As darkness enveloped the island, Kawaguchi's infantry began their approach. 3 battalions, over 3,000 men, moved silently through the jungle toward Edson's thinly held line. Japanese soldiers had removed boots to move more quietly, advancing barefoot through terrain that would tear unprotected feet to shreds. Officers synchronized watches, preparing to launch coordinated assaults at precisely 9 o'clock. The first Japanese probe struck a thin section of line held by a single Marine platoon. Grenades and small arms fire erupted along the ridge as infiltrators attempted to locate weak points in American defenses. Edson, a veteran known as Red Mike for his russet hair and aggressive tactics, moved calmly through his positions, repositioning machine guns and encouraging men who could hear thousands of enemy soldiers preparing to attack through the darkness beyond their perimeter. What followed would become known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, though the Marines defending it would always call it Bloody Ridge. September 13th, 1942, plunged Edson's Marines into a nightmare that would last 2 consecutive nights. At 9 o'clock precisely, 3,000 Japanese infantry surged from the jungle with fixed bayonets, screaming battle cries designed to paralyze their enemies with fear. The first wave crashed against American positions like a human tsunami, soldiers climbing over each other in their determination to reach the Marine foxholes. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Page commanded a machine gun section on the western slope of the ridge. His 4 guns opened fire simultaneously, tracer rounds drawing red lines through the darkness as Japanese infantry materialized from the jungle in numbers that seemed impossible. The Marines fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maximizing casualties, but the enemy kept coming. A Japanese grenade landed in Page's position, and he threw it back before it exploded, then immediately resumed firing. Around him, Marines fought hand-to-hand with attackers who broke through the defensive line. Entrenching tools cracked skulls, rifle butts smashed faces, and men grappled in the mud, each trying to kill before being killed. The fighting was primal, stripped of military doctrine, reduced to its savage essence. Colonel Edson walked the ridge throughout the night, seemingly immune to the bullets cracking past his head and the shells exploding around him. He pulled men from quiet sectors to reinforce positions under heaviest pressure, redistributing ammunition and encouraging defenders who could see hundreds of enemy corpses accumulating before their positions, but feared the thousands more coming behind them. Private Robert Leckie, dug in with the 1st Marine Regiment, later described the sound as unlike anything in his experience. A continuous roar of small arms fire punctuated by grenade explosions and the screams of wounded men calling for corpsmen who could not reach them through the intense fire. The ridge became obscured by smoke and dust thrown up by explosions, reducing visibility to arm's length even when Japanese flares periodically illuminated the battlefield in flickering white light. Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi committed his reserves at midnight, throwing fresh battalions against positions where Marine defenders were running critically low on ammunition. Some machine guns fell silent, not because their crews were dead, but because they had exhausted their ammunition and were reduced to firing individual rifles at targets they selected with increasing desperation. American artillery, firing from positions near Henderson Field, dropped shells in danger-close patterns that killed Japanese and Marines alike. Forward observers called corrections by sound, unable to see through the darkness and smoke. The earth shook continuously as 105mm howitzer shells detonated, crossed the southern approaches to the ridge, creating a curtain of high explosives that any advancing Japanese soldier must penetrate. By dawn, on September 14th, the ridge remained in Marine hands, but barely. Bodies of Japanese soldiers lay in windows before the Marine positions, some stacked 3 deep where machine gun fire had caught them in the open. Edson counted his survivors and found he had lost nearly 40% of his effective strength, Ammunition was critically low. Medical supplies were exhausted. The corpsmen worked frantically to stabilize wounded men for evacuation, but Japanese artillery made movement in daylight, suicidal. Kawaguchi regrouped his forces during the day, dragging wounded back into the jungle and preparing for a second night assault. He had underestimated American defensive capabilities, but remained confident that one more determined push would break through to Henderson Field. Japanese doctrine emphasized perseverance and fighting spirit, qualities his soldiers had demonstrated through their willingness to charge into machine gun fire without hesitation. The second night, September 14th into 15th, proved even more desperate than the first. Kawaguchi attacked with his remaining strength, approximately 2,000 men, against fewer than 500 effective Marines still holding the ridge. Staff Sergeant Page found himself alone at his position, his entire squad killed or wounded. He lifted his machine gun from its tripod and fired from the hip, walking forward into advancing Japanese soldiers. The battle reached a crisis point near dawn, when Japanese infantry penetrated the American line at multiple points. For minutes, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Marine reserves counterattacked, men too exhausted to do anything but put one foot in front of the other, driving the Japanese back down the ridge through sheer stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat. October 11th, 1942, found both sides locked in a grinding war of attrition that neither could afford to lose. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his headquarters aboard the battleship Yamato, committed substantial naval forces to what had become an obsession: the recapture of Guadalcanal and the destruction of Henderson Field. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita received orders to lead a bombardment force that would reduce Henderson Field to rubble, destroying its aircraft and rendering the runway unusable. His force included the heavy cruisers Ioba, Kinagasa, and Furutaka, vessels equipped with 8-inch guns capable of firing high-explosive shells weighing 250 pounds over 20 miles. The Americans had reinforced their naval presence in the area following the Savo Island disaster. Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded a task force centered on cruisers San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena, supported by 5 destroyers. Scott was determined to intercept the Tokyo Express, and unlike the commanders at Savo Island, he had time to prepare and drill his forces in night combat tactics. The naval forces collided near Cape Esperance on the northwestern coast of Guadalcanal at 11:46 on the night of October 11th. The Battle of Cape Esperance began when American radar, superior to Japanese equipment, detected Kurita's ships crossing in front of the American formation. Scott seized the tactical advantage of surprise, ordering his cruisers to open fire while Japanese lookouts were still straining to locate the American ships in the darkness. USS Helena's 6-inch gun spoke first, sending shells screaming toward the cruiser Ioba at ranges under 5,000 yards. The initial salvos struck Ioba's superstructure, killing Admiral Goto instantly as he stood on the bridge trying to determine whether the ships firing on him were friend or foe. Japanese doctrine emphasized radio silence, a tactical principle that created fatal confusion in the darkness, as ships from both sides maneuvered at high speed through restricted waters. Furutaka took multiple hits that started fires visible for miles, illuminating the heavy cruiser for further targeting. American destroyers launched torpedoes that spread through the engagement area, their wakes creating white lines across black water. One struck Furutaka below the waterline, flooding her engine rooms and leaving the cruiser dead in the water and sinking by the bow. The destroyer USS Duncan, caught between the battle lines, took fire from both sides in the confusion. Shells from Japanese cruisers punched through her thin hull, while friendly fire from American ships added to her wounds. Her captain fought to save his ship even as fires spread from stem to stern, but Duncan was doomed. She sank shortly after midnight, taking many of her crew with her. Salt Lake City maneuvered aggressively, her 8-inch guns firing as fast as crews could load them. But a Japanese shell penetrated her hull at the waterline, and seawater began flooding internal compartments. Damage control parties struggled to contain the flooding while the cruiser continued fighting, her main batteries never falling silent despite the mortal wound she had suffered. The battle lasted less than an hour before Japanese forces withdrew, leaving Furutaka sinking and Ioba heavily damaged. American losses included Duncan sunk and Boise severely damaged by 11 shell hits that nearly reached her magazines. Had those shells penetrated a few more inches, Boise would have exploded with the loss of all hands. Despite tactical success at Cape Esperance, the Tokyo Express continued running. Destroyers adapted their tactics, approaching at higher speeds and landing troops at multiple points along Guadalcanal's coast. Each night, Japanese soldiers and supplies arrived on the island, building up forces for what Tokyo planners envisioned as a final decisive offensive. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayokutake arrived on Guadalcanal to personally command the coming assault. He brought the 2nd Division, veteran troops who had fought in China and Java, raising Japanese ground strength to over 20,000 men. American intelligence estimated enemy forces at 15,000, an error that would nearly prove fatal. Henderson Field continued operating despite nightly bombardments from Japanese warships and artillery positioned in the surrounding hills. Marine and Navy pilots flew until their aircraft literally fell apart from tropical corrosion and combat damage. Mechanics performed miracles with inadequate tools and scavenged parts. October 13, 1942, brought terror from the sea unlike anything the Marines on Guadalcanal had yet experienced. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's bombardment force included not cruisers but battleships, Congo and Haruna, each mounting 8 14-inch guns capable of throwing shells weighing over 1,400 pounds across vast distances. The bombardment began at 1:33 in the morning when Congo's forward turrets erupted in flame, sending shells arcing toward Henderson Field from ranges of 16,000 yards. The Marines had endured cruiser bombardments before, but battleship shells were different entirely. Each high-explosive round detonated with enough force to create craters 15 feet deep and 30 feet across. Private First Class Robert Leckie crouched in his foxhole as the earth heaved and shuddered. Shells landed in patterns that walked across Henderson Field, systematically destroying everything above ground. Aircraft caught in revetments were blown to pieces, their aluminum skin and fabric control surfaces offering no protection against blast waves that could kill through overpressure alone. Fuel dumps exploded in towers of flame that illuminated the island like daylight. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes, during which Congo and Haruna fired 918 shells of 14-inch ammunition. Henderson Field ceased to exist as an operational airfield. The runway resembled the surface of the moon, cratered beyond recognition. Every above-ground structure had been destroyed. 48 aircraft were reduced to burning wreckage. Aviation fuel that had taken weeks to accumulate burned in massive conflagrations that would smolder for days. Major General Alexander Van de Grift emerged from his command bunker at dawn to survey devastation beyond his worst nightmares. Henderson Field, the prize that made holding Guadalcanal strategically viable, had been effectively neutralized. Marine engineers began filling craters with bulldozers and compacting coral, but everyone understood the Japanese would return the following night to finish what they had started. Admiral William Halsey, newly appointed to replace Vice Admiral Gormley as commander South Pacific Area, received reports of the bombardment with fury. Halsey was an aggressive officer who had earned the nickname Bull through his willingness to take risks and his contempt for defensive thinking. He immediately ordered reinforcements, rushed to Guadalcanal, and began planning offensive operations that would challenge Japanese naval superiority around the Solomons. The Japanese returned on October 14th with cruisers that added another 750 shells to the devastation. Henderson Field remained non-operational, unable to launch aircraft to defend against Japanese transports that began arriving in daylight. Confident that American air power had been neutralized, 6 transports carrying troops, ammunition, and heavy equipment beached themselves near Tassafaranga and began unloading in full view of Marine positions. Marine artillery opened fire on the transports, scoring hits that started fires and killed soldiers waiting ashore, but the Japanese continued unloading with methodical determination. 4,000 fresh troops reached the island along with tanks, artillery pieces, and enough ammunition to support sustained offensive operations. The strategic balance on Guadalcanal had shifted decisively in Japan's favor. But Marine engineers worked miracles. By October 15th, they had patched the runway sufficiently to allow emergency operations. A handful of aircraft, patched together from wrecked machines, managed to take off and attack the grounded transports. Dive bombers with barely enough fuel to reach the target area scored hits that destroyed thousands of tons of supplies still aboard the beached ships. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayokutake watched these attacks and understood his window of opportunity was closing. If Henderson became fully operational again, His forces would face the same supply difficulties that had strangled previous Japanese offensives. He issued orders for an all-out assault on October 23rd, an operation designed to overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The Sendai Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would conduct the main assault from the south, striking through the same jungle that had consumed Kawaguchi's forces. October 23, 1942, marked the beginning of the largest Japanese ground offensive of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama led 7,000 men of the Sendai Division through jungles so dense that entire companies lost contact with adjacent units. Men struggled through swamps where water reached their chests, holding rifles and ammunition above their heads, while leeches attached themselves to any exposed flesh. The approach march became an ordeal that depleted Japanese forces before they even reached American lines. Soldiers abandoned heavy equipment they could no longer carry through the impossible terrain. Artillery pieces intended to support the assault were left behind, mired in mud or blocked by ridges too steep to traverse. Food ran out, and men survived on handfuls of rice supplemented by whatever they could forage from the jungle. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller commanded the 1st Battalion, Marines, defending a sector south of Henderson Field designated as the Lunja Perimeter. Puller was already legendary among Marines for his aggressive tactics and absolute fearlessness under fire. He walked his defensive positions in the days before the Japanese attack, ensuring fields of fire were cleared and ammunition was distributed for immediate access. The Japanese assault began on October 24th, with preliminary probes designed to locate weak points in American defenses. Small groups of soldiers infiltrated between Marine positions, attempting to create confusion and identify targets for the main assault. Puller's Marines engaged these infiltrators with rifle fire and grenades, preventing them from establishing positions inside the perimeter. Maruyama delayed the main assault twice due to difficulties getting his forces into position. But on October 25th at 7 o'clock in the evening, the Sendai Division surged forward in a coordinated attack that struck Marine positions along a 2-mile front. The Japanese advanced in columns that flowed around strongpoints, seeking gaps and weaknesses rather than battering against fortified positions. Sergeant John Bacelone, who had distinguished himself at the Tenaru River, again found himself at the center of desperate fighting. His machine gun section occupied a critical position where jungle gave way to more open ground, creating a natural avenue of approach toward Henderson Field. When the Japanese attack materialized from the darkness, Bacelone's guns opened fire at ranges under 50 yards. The battle devolved into a chaotic melee illuminated by muzzle flashes, exploding grenades, and the harsh white light of flares that Japanese forces launched to identify Marine positions. Bacelone's machine guns fired continuously until barrels glowed red from sustained fire. When ammunition began running low, he organized supply parties to bring more forward, personally carrying belts of ammunition through enemy fire that killed or wounded men around him. A Japanese mortar round landed directly on one of Bacelone's gun positions, killing the crew instantly. Without hesitation, Bacelone dragged the machine gun from the destroyed position, cleared a jam caused by flying debris, and resumed firing from a new location. His actions prevented a breakthrough that would have allowed Japanese forces to penetrate deep into the rear areas where Henderson Field's aircraft sat vulnerable. Colonel Puller moved through his positions throughout the night, seemingly oblivious to danger. He directed artillery fire from batteries positioned near Henderson Field, calling strikes so close to Marine positions that some shells fell inside the perimeter. When officers suggested he take cover, Puller reportedly replied that his men needed to see him standing while they fought. The fighting continued without pause through October 25th and into the early morning hours of October 26th. Japanese soldiers attacked repeatedly, each wave suffering catastrophic casualties from interlocking fields of machine gun and rifle fire. Bodies accumulated in heaps before Marine positions. But Japanese officers continued ordering attacks with a determination bordering on madness. By dawn on October 26th, the Sendai Division had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the jungle south of the perimeter. Maruyama withdrew his survivors, abandoning wounded who could not walk, and leaving trails marked by discarded equipment and bodies of men who collapsed from exhaustion and starvation. The battle had been the last throw of the dice for Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. They had committed their best troops in a coordinated offensive that should have overwhelmed the Marine defenders, and they had been decisively defeated. November 12, 1942, brought the final act of the Guadalcanal drama as naval forces from both sides converged for what would become the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded a Japanese force including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, intent on destroying Henderson Field once and for all. Opposing him was Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, with a hastily assembled force of cruisers and destroyers, outnumbered and outgunned, but determined to protect the Marines ashore. The forces collided at 1:48 in the morning in waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, the same area where American ships had been slaughtered 3 months earlier. The battle began with both sides detecting each other simultaneously at ranges under 3,000 yards. So close that large ships could not depress their main batteries enough to hit targets. And the engagement devolved into a point-blank brawl, fought at knife-fighting range. USS Atlanta, a light cruiser equipped with anti-aircraft guns rather than heavy ship-killing weapons, found herself between two battleships firing at each other. Japanese shells from Hiei tore through Atlanta's thin armor, while shells from American ships added to her destruction. Admiral Norman Scott, aboard Atlanta as an observer, was killed instantly when the bridge took a direct hit. The cruiser drifted dead in the water, her crew fighting fires that threatened to reach the magazines. Callahan's flagship, USS San Francisco, engaged Hiei in a duel that resembled ancient ship-of-the-line combat more than modern naval warfare. San Francisco's Atinch guns fired into Hiei's superstructure from ranges so close that shells sometimes passed completely through the battleship without exploding. Hiei's 14-inch guns responded, and one shell penetrated San Francisco's bridge, killing Admiral Callahan and his entire staff. The destroyer USS Laffey, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hank, charged directly at Hiei with suicidal courage. Laffey closed to within yards of the battleship and raked her superstructure, with Finch gunfire that destroyed rangefinders and fire control systems. Japanese secondary batteries returned fire, and Laffey was torn apart by shells that exploded inside her hull. She sank within minutes, but not before her sacrifice had contributed to Hiei's eventual destruction. By dawn, the sea around Savo Island was littered with burning ships and survivors clinging to debris. Hiei, damaged and uncontrollable, was attacked repeatedly by aircraft from Henderson Field as she attempted to withdraw. Marine dive bombers scored hits that started uncontrollable fires, and the Japanese were forced to scuttle their battleship to prevent its capture. The first battleship Japan had lost in the war. American losses were severe. 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk, with most surviving ships damaged. But Henderson Field remained operational, and the Japanese would never again attempt a major surface engagement in support of their ground forces on Guadalcanal. 2 nights later, on November 14th, the battleship USS Washington engaged and destroyed Kirishima in a one-sided duel that demonstrated American radar fire control superiority. Washington's 16-inch guns, directed by radar that could track targets in complete darkness, struck Kirishima repeatedly at ranges where the Japanese could not even see their opponent. Kirishima sank, and with her went Japanese hopes of controlling the waters around Guadalcanal. By February 9, 1943, the Japanese had evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. Abandoning the island they had once considered insignificant. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers had died on Guadalcanal or in the surrounding waters. American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed and another 8,000 wounded or missing. The strategic significance of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in a sustained campaign and forced to abandon territory. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of unbroken victories, lay shattered on a jungle island that most Americans could not find on a map before August 1942. Henderson Field, built with Korean labor for Japanese aircraft, became the springboard for Allied offensives that would island hop across the Pacific toward Tokyo. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal about amphibious operations, jungle warfare, and combined arms tactics would inform every subsequent campaign. The Marines who survived Guadalcanal carried physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. They had endured tropical diseases, starvation rations, constant bombardment, and an enemy who fought with a ferocity that defied rational military calculation. They had held a tenuous perimeter through determination and mutual support when any rational assessment suggested withdrawal. Major General Alexander Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor for his leadership throughout the campaign. Sergeant John Bacelone received the same award for his actions on Bloody Ridge and during the October battles. He would die on Iwo Jima in February 1945, still a sergeant because he refused promotion that would take him away from leading Marines in combat. Guadalcanal changed everything. It marked the point where American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and the courage of individual service members combined to halt Japanese expansion and begin the long, bloody road to Tokyo Bay, the island that nobody wanted. The jungle-covered speck that appeared on no strategic planning documents before August 1942 had become the place where empires collided and the future was decided. Those who fought there, on both sides, understood they had participated in something that transcended military operations, a crucible where the trajectory of the 20th century was forever altered. The island of death had changed everything.